Coach Greg, and today I'm going over the top 10 never again. 10 exercises that you should just never do again.
Come on, Coach Greg, I'm worried about you, man. You're starting to sound just a little bit too much like Jeff Cavalier in this one. What's up, guys? Enkiri here. Today we're going to review a recent video by Coach Greg Doucette where he discusses his list of the top 10 exercises to avoid from here on out. And I have to say that I am a little bit concerned here about our beloved Coach Greg, as he is starting to sound eerily similar to Jeff Cavalier of AthleteNext.com and his famed Iron Graveyard.
And that is, we're visiting the Iron Graveyard, where all exercises that we've killed in the past reside.
Look, I have said this before and I'll say it again. There are no contraindicated exercises. There are only contraindicated people. And the problem here, both with Jeff before and with Greg now, making these sort of hot button blanket assertions, is that you are demonizing an entire pattern of human movement and scaring people into thinking that certain positions are inherently dangerous to occupy simply by virtue of their existence. But that is simply not true. Nearly any position that can be occupied during the course of a weight training can be safely occupied by somebody, somewhere out there. Now, you may not be that person, but then we can't blame the exercise itself for that. We cannot blanketly say that absolutely no one anywhere should do this, or that no one anywhere can benefit from this, because that is simply an unequivocally false statement.
10 exercises that you should just never do again. They're overrated, they're dangerous, they're stupid, they don't build muscle, they're kind of useless,
And I understand that Greg has a very large audience and he is tailoring his content these days to the masses, and that makes sense. But in spite of that, I do think that videos like Greg's here are just kind of unnecessary in general. And there were a few very iffy inclusions here as well, where people would be potentially shortchanging their results and their progress in the long run if they're a newbie right now and they take Greg's advice here and they simply never do any of these exercises again, and they simply never think about it again. And I do want to touch on a couple of those just for example purposes in more detail in just a moment, because I don't agree with Greg's assertions there and his logic and why he's telling you to cut some of those exercises out. But before I get to that part, I want to point something else out. As an overarching theme here, rather than Greg frame his argument in his video as essentially these exercises are dangerous and you're going to get hurt if you do them, rather than blanketly demonizing or canceling, for lack of a better term, canceling entire exercises, personally I would prefer something more along the lines of, from the perspective of building strength and building muscle, these particular exercises are suboptimal in terms of their risk to reward ratio, especially for newer lifters. So here are some alternatives that I think get the job done in a more optimal fashion for the greater majority of people. Here, you would be taking that argument, which is essentially an argument of negative reinforcement, right? Do this and something bad will happen, the boogeyman, right? And instead, you're flipping that on its head and you're using an argument of positive reinforcement. Use these better alternatives and something better will happen instead. That's just a better way of framing it that will appeal to people in a positive way rather than a negative one. And it'll encourage them into making good decisions rather than trying to scare them away from making what you've deemed to be bad decisions. And it just helps people to keep a more open mind and keep their options open, right? I just wrapped up a review of the knees over toes guy last week, and think about him, think about a guy like that and what he is advocating. If he had come out onto the scene even as recently as just 5 years ago, he would have gotten eviscerated, absolutely fucking eviscerated off of the platform altogether. AthleteNext and everyone else of his ilk would have jumped onto the highest motherfucking horse that they could find and fucking ripped him a new one. Commandment number 1, thy knees shall never cross thy toes. Knees over toes guy, I hereby sentence you to be burned at the stake. But that didn't happen because the tides have shifted. Even if certain individuals are still stuck in their old ways, the industry as a whole is more amenable to the fact that the human body is actually a durable, resilient, and malleable piece of machinery. We actually have a lot of agency in dictating what positions or movements will potentially hurt us versus what will make us stronger and more resilient, if we go about implementing those things properly and progressing into them properly. That is knees over toes, guys' entire message, right? We hurt ourselves by doing too much too soon or by not managing cumulative fatigue properly. Not because any position is inherently dangerous to occupy. And in an ironic, almost hair of the dog sort of sentiment, what ails you can also potentially be what will cure you. You just need to adjust it to the correct dosage. Find the right volume and find the right intensity level that the body can adapt to, that can stimulate adaptation without causing excessive breakdown, and then build up slowly from there as the tissues and the system acclimates and grows. This is how somebody like Knees Over Toes guy can burst out onto the scene and have people actually be receptive to his message and what he's saying, rather than just shut him down immediately without even really hearing him out. And so of the list of 10 exercises that Greg presented to avoid forever, I'd like to take a closer look at just a few of them and point out some of the shortcomings in Greg's arguments here and why his logic doesn't really work for what he's saying. And my intention here is not to bash Greg. Okay, this isn't an attack video. The dude's been around the block and he's incredibly knowledgeable, and I would never try to take that away from him. But he does at times have a narrow scope that he views things through, one that's been somewhat biased by the bodybuilding world that he's immersed in. And personally, I think that analyzing things from outside of that scope and opening up the perspective a little bit could potentially be helpful for some of his viewers. So that is really what I'm hoping to accomplish today. So let's take a closer look at some of the exercises.
As to grass squats, you don't need to squat this deep to build muscle. Unless you're born with the hip sockets to handle it, it's going to be dangerous for you. We all carry a certain amount of flexibility, and the smart thing is to not go further than your body allows you. This is another dangerous old school exercise we used to do back in the day. Most people do not have the shoulder flexibility required to do this exercise effectively.
Both of these exercises have been around for a very long time, but these days you really only see them performed mostly by Olympic weightlifters anyway. Now, they do both require large degrees of mobility in order to be performed successfully, and you can also argue, as Greg does, that they both require you to be born with a specific anatomical structure to utilize them with optimal success. And Greg's argument here beyond that, though, essentially boils down to something like this. Most people lack the requisite mobility to perform these exercises correctly, and most people end up doing these exercises wrong. But is that argument really strong enough to write these exercises off altogether? Is that really enough to say that these exercises are useless and that they're ineffective and that they don't build muscle? Because I really don't think we can take it that far. They obviously build muscle and they obviously build strength. You only need to look at Clarence Kennedy or Dmitry Klokov or really just any Chinese weightlifter to figure that part out. But here's the thing. As Greg says, these exercises require a large degree of mobility. He's not wrong about that. But that also means that by performing them, you're also maintaining large degrees of mobility. It means that you're also strengthening the knees and the shoulders and the hips in those end range positions which are often neglected, and as such the training effect is going to be somewhat different from these exercises as well. Personally, I went from being able to bottom out ass to grass squat with 450 pounds to being able to squat 530 pounds roughly to parallel for powerlifting competitions, and I could feel the differences that the different training had on my body. My legs are bigger and they are stronger now than they were before, yes, but my hips were much more mobile and much more supple previously when I used to train through that full range, that maximal range of motion. My overall mobility was better and I had the strength and the stability in those end range positions to back it up. And in terms of sports like football or combat sports, or really any endeavor where you could potentially end up in an unpredictable or an extreme position, having trained yourself to be able to handle that position adequately and safely and to be strong and stable throughout it is probably a good idea. Does this mean that these exercises are for everybody? No, of course not. But just because most people can't do them right does not mean that we can call them useless or that we should throw them out altogether, as Greg has suggested here. That would be like suggesting that the jump shot in basketball is worthless because most casual players have a shitty jump shot. But that's not sound logic. There are obvious benefits to be had here for certain populations, but because the positions involved are a little bit more extreme, it becomes that much more important to ensure proper movement execution, proper loading, and proper training volume when performing these exercises, which are aspects that most casual trainees ignore. But that is not the fault of the exercise. That is the fault of the trainee. So let's try not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, okay?
Good mornings. Commonly performed exercise by powerlifters to strengthen the lower back. However, for most people, you can simply end up hurting your lower back. Loading up a bunch of weight on your back and then leaning forward and then standing upright is a good way to get your back hurt. It places a lot of force on the lower back when bending forward, and if you go too heavy in particular, you're very likely to get injured. It's simply not a safe and effective exercise.
Again, you're going to have to define safe and effective here, because this exercise is perfectly fine for anyone who knows how to hinge their hips properly. It's only unsafe if you don't know how to perform the exercise correctly, in which case the fault doesn't really lie with the exercise because you're not actually doing the exercise, or it's unsafe if you go too heavy on it, in which case, again, the fault doesn't really lie with the exercise. It lies with your inability to control your ego. An improperly performed good morning is not a good morning. It's typically just a bastardized squat, and most people absolutely cannot good morning as much weight as they think they can. At its core, though, the movement pattern, when it's executed correctly, is basically identical to a Romanian deadlift, and no one really has a problem with the Romanian deadlift, and it's quite similar to a hyperextension as well. It's basically a pure hip hinge with minimal knee action. The primary difference is that during an RDL, the bar is in the hands, whereas during a good morning, it's on the back. So with an RDL, the lever arm acting on the lower back is a lot shorter, meaning that the emphasis of the exercise ends up being more so on the hips and on the hamstrings. Whereas with a good morning, due to the orientation of the weight, the lever arm acting on the lower back is a little bit longer, meaning that the lower back and even the middle and the upper back end up playing a much larger role in the movement. But that's not a bad thing. If your goal is to get a stronger back or a bigger squat, and you know how to hinge properly at the hips, which any good coach should be able to teach you how to do, if you know how to hinge properly at the hips while maintaining a neutral spine, then you would be silly not to include this exercise in your program at least some of the time. If it's conducive to your goals, then it's conducive to your goals. The movement pattern itself is no more dangerous than any other hinge movement pattern, and it has earned its place in the strength and performance training world because it is highly effective at accomplishing these aforementioned things when it's programmed and performed correctly. Changing the orientation of the load does not inherently make the movement pattern any more or less dangerous than it was before. It simply shifts the muscular emphasis that the exercise has. But when you claim that the exercise is dangerous because it has the potential to stress the spine when it's done incorrectly, you are strawmanning the actual exercise, because what you are referring to is not the actual exercise anymore. Loading up too much weight and using your sternum as a catapult during the bench press is also dangerous, and plenty of people do that. But that's not actually bench pressing, and you wouldn't suggest throwing out the bench press altogether because of that. So why suggest throwing out the good morning? Someone performing an exercise wrong does not dictate the safety or the efficacy of the actual exercise. And the good morning is a very useful tool for strengthening the back and hypertrophying the hamstrings. There's no reason to throw out your hammer just because you happen to be out of nails.
Full sit-ups. Back in the day, we used to put our feet under the couch and do sit-ups, or we'd have a partner sit on our feet and press us down. We'd see how many sit-ups we could do in a minute. It was a sprint competition. This is a lot more dangerous to the lower back, and rather than doing these full sit-ups, just do crunches instead. There's no reason to do full sit-ups like this anymore. Simple crunches will suffice.
Now, can you spot what's wrong with his example here? I'll give you guys a couple seconds to figure it out. Okay, so he says,
we'd see how many sit-ups we could do in a minute. It was a sprint competition.
I mean, yeah, obviously that's not a very good idea. Stuart McGill has warned us of the potential for spinal disc injury via repeated spinal flexion. So to do so under competitive conditions for time with fatigue accumulating and while trying to crank out as many reps as you can as fast as possible is highly suboptimal and is going to lead to a lot of really sloppy reps, a lot of pressure on the spinal discs, and not much actual work for the abdominal muscles. But, and I hate to sound like a broken record at this point, but that is not really the fault of the exercise. The fault lies with the silly constraints that you chose to perform it under. In a healthy spine, there's nothing wrong with a well-controlled, well-executed sit-up. After all, the function of the rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscle, is to flex the spine. And Greg provides us with an alternative for that here, the crunch, which is a perfectly fine exercise in its own right. However, the difference is that the crunch isolates the abdominal muscles by focusing solely on curling up the spine, whereas the classic sit-up involves the abdominal muscles along with the assistance of the hip flexors to help pull the torso all the way up to a fully seated position. Where performance training is concerned, as opposed to just aesthetics training, this is actually an important distinction because in real life, the hip flexors are actually an important group of muscles that work in conjunction with the quote-unquote core. Anytime that you pull your thigh up to run or to sprint, those muscles, the hip flexors, are engaging. And the stronger they are, the better off you'll be. But the fact is, they're often weak in a lot of people because not only do we not train them directly at all like we do with most other muscle groups, but we also actively go out of our way and attempt to outright ignore them and remove them from the equation altogether, like with the crunch. I can only imagine due to a cultural overemphasis on the idea of the six-pack. In real life, though, these muscle groups work together. Your hip flexors have a functional purpose. They're not just there for fun, and they should be trained like any other muscle group. And the sit-up is one way of at least getting some engagement going on there that most people would otherwise never get. But the point is that this exercise has its value. It's certainly not useless, and it has its place in the training program. And discarding it altogether because it has historically been performed under stupid conditions is simply an overreaction to the problem. And that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to cover today, guys. Just a few examples pointing out some of the major things that I disagreed with in that video. And as I mentioned before, this is not an attack on Greg. So no one needs to get offended about it. It's simply an alternative perspective that I'm offering. Greg and I have different training histories, and those different histories have afforded us different vantage points on many things when it comes to weight training and general fitness. And that is a good thing. And we're all still learning. And the more information that we can put out there, and the more different perspectives that we can give you guys and that you guys have available to pull from, the better. So hopefully, if you are a Coach Greg fan, you are able to take something helpful away from this video that you'll be able to use in your own training in the future, or at the very least, hopefully you'll analyze each exercise that he discussed in his video just a little bit deeper in regards to your own training goals and your own injury history and your own body and anatomy before you decide to discard all of them for the long term just because Greg said you should. And that's all I got for today, guys. Please be sure to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and definitely leave me some love in the comments down below. And if you're interested in online coaching and training programs, be sure to check out my website, www.enkirielitefitness.com, for more details. Keep training hard, and I will catch you guys next time.